before I get to that, he is, of course, also a fellow of MESH currently as a Humboldt Research Prize holder. And Tom will be visiting with us from time to time in the coming years, thanks to the Humboldt Foundation. Tom describes himself as a field philosopher, and he is a fabulous writer. His books include Flightways, Life and Loss at the Edge of Extinction, The Wake of Crows, Living and Dying in Shared Worlds, and A World in a Shell, Snail Stories for a Time of Extinctions. He's a co-founder of the field of extinction studies and multi-species studies, and was also founding co-editor of the leading journal in the field of environmental humanities, the journal Environmental Humanities. So Tom, thank you once again for being with us here online, and it's over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Kate. And thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person due to family illness. Otherwise, I would really love to be there. As Kate mentioned, the Sydney Environment Institute is also sort of co-sponsoring this event. So I wanted to say on behalf of SEI, welcome. And it's lovely that this event is happening, and we look forward to many future collaborations with MESH. So before I begin, I'll just acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Darug and Gundungurra people, the Blue Mountains in Australia, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. The stories I want to share with you tonight, or today for you, sorry, are actually from another colonised land, though, from the islands of Hawaii. And so I also want to acknowledge the ongoing efforts of Kanaka Maoli, of the Native Hawaiian people, to protect and care for culture and land to Aloha Aina. So I'll just jump right into this paper. I'm not sure how it happened, but I've somehow found myself captivated by snails. To be specific, my fascination really centres on the terrestrial snails of Hawaii. From the beautifully patterned Achatonella lila that make their homes in the trees, cleaning rather than eating leaves, through to the ground-dwelling species that consume and recycle dead matter, species like Laminella sanguinea, which incidentally is equally beautiful, but you wouldn't know it because it covers its shell with a thin layer of its own excrement for reasons that aren't really fully understood. Despite their differences, one thing that these two snails have in common is that they're both critically endangered. The Hawaiian Islands were once home to over 750 species of land snails, one of the most diverse assemblages to be found anywhere on Earth. Sadly, however, almost 2/3 of these species are now extinct, and the vast majority of those that remain are headed swiftly in the same direction. The causes of this ongoing decline are complex. In the past, these snails suffered from extensive habitat loss as land was cleared for farming, ranching, tourism, the military, and more. For 100 years or so, a shell collecting craze led by missionary sons also decimated many species. The remaining species today are threatened primarily by introduced predators like rats, chameleons, and most significantly of all, a carnivorous snail, Euglandina rosea, a meticulous and disturbingly efficient predator of other snails. But the puzzle that first drew me into thinking seriously about Hawaii snails, the question that first captured my interest and curiosity, was how did all these snails end up out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean on the most remote oceanic archipelago in the world? Land snails, after all, aren't known for their propensity to undertake long journeys, not by land and certainly not by sea. When we add to this fact their intolerance for salt water, the situation becomes even more confounding. As Charles Darwin summed it up many years ago, land mollusks are a great perplexity to me. So I've started this talk with snails, and their mucus-covered forms will weave a network of silvery pathways through what follows. My aim in this talk is to present a potted overview of multi-species studies as I've practiced it, and in so doing to explore how this work might speak to the key themes animating this conference. The snails, I hope, will serve as guides and empirical grounds for the points that I'd like to make, drawing in particular on my recent book. So in this talk, I'd like to slow down with three key topics. Firstly, what is it that characterises multi-species work? And I'll focus on passionate immersion, drawing on Anna Singh's work, and ask about the ramifications of such an approach for the way in which we take up and work with the diverse knowledges about the lives of non-human others. Secondly, I'll focus on storytelling to ask what it is and what it does in a multi-species context. Two particular interests of mine in this context are the ethical charge of storytelling and the capacity for multi-species stories to create new openings into questions of intra-human inequality and oppression. And thirdly, I'll offer some thoughts on the species category. What might we mean by it in multi-species work, and how might thinking with and against species as taxonomic units help us to see the world differently? So taken together, my hope is that these three strands will provide a fuller picture of the possibilities opened up by a distinctively multi-species approach to storytelling in and for these catastrophic times, to borrow a phrase from Isabelle Stengers. So in the concluding section of the paper, I'll turn more explicitly to that topic, considering the role of multi-species stories in understanding and responding to disasters. So, attending to scientists as they attend to snails is one of the key ways in which I've practiced the art of what Anna Singh calls passionate immersion in the lives of non-human others. I take this kind of immersion to be the hallmark of multi-species scholarship, as I argued in a co-authored paper with Eben Kirksey and Ursula Munster. So this kind of immersion aims to provide thick accounts of the distinctive experiential worlds, modes of being, and biocultural attachments of other species. Immersive ways of knowing and being with others involve careful attention to what matters to them, attention to how they craft shared lives and worlds. In short, passionate immersion means becoming curious and so entangled, learning to be affected, and so perhaps to understand and care a little differently. This is a broad mandate and one that can be taken up in a diverse range of ways, drawing on diverse knowledge traditions. In my own work, the knowledges about other species of various scientists, from taxonomists and ecologists to cognitive biologists and biogeographers, has frequently been brought into conversation with the knowledges of Indigenous peoples. But other multi-species scholars have drawn in systematic ways on the other than human knowledges of hunters, farmers, fishers, animal trainers, artists, and many others. Of course, all of these ways of knowing, of taking an interest in what interests other species, are grounded in particular practices and systems of knowledge making, whether they're those of the close observation of the ethnographer or the laboratory studies of various scientists. As decades of critical scholarship in the humanities and social sciences has explored, these practices and systems of knowledge making have histories and politics. None of them provides unmediated access to the lives of other organisms and species. And so in engaging these literatures and approaches, we're drawn into epistemic questions about how we or others know what we think we know about non-humans. Of course, these epistemic questions are not just that. They are, in Karen Barad's terms, ethico-onto-epistemic questions. That is, questions that require us to ask how what we think we know comes to matter, always unequally, in the lives and worlds of others. So I take this kind of situated interrogation of our knowledges about non-human others to be a core part of multi-species scholarship. But it can't become the sole focus. Passionate immersion in the lives of non-humans is not the same thing as a passion for what various humans think about the lives of non-humans. Focusing exclusively or primarily on humans and their knowledge-making practices in relation to other species allows the non-humans to fall into the background, as they have so often before for scholars in the humanities and social sciences, to become an always deferred object of empirical exploration. As Deborah Bird Rose was fond of summing up such a situation, we end up with humans talking about animals. And that's if we're lucky. Many more degrees of deferral are possible in discussions of how the film critic reads the philosopher's discussion of the artwork of the animal, etc. While this kind of work certainly has an important place in multi-species scholarship, for me, it's not what characterises it. Instead, passionate immersion asks us to also try to say something meaningful about the actual lives of non-human others. As Donna Haraway described it in When Species Meet, to take that tentative step of interspecies curiosity. In short, it's a scholarship that feels a need to keep coming back, to be genuinely interested in the lives of non-human others, how they live, what matters to them, how they make meaning in relationships, how they make worlds. We have to do that carefully, tentatively, critically, but we must also try to give an account of non-human modes of life. In much of my own work on extinction, the effort to thickly describe the way of life of a given species is an attempt to capture in some way what's being lost, its uniqueness and its significance to diverse others. In this way, these descriptions aim to draw audiences into these non-human worlds and create spaces for wonder, appreciation, and care to bubble up. At its core, this is an effort to work with knowledges about non-human lives in a particular way. To sum things up too crudely, we might understand multi-species studies as an approach that combines the impulses of science and technology studies and natural history writing. There are STS accounts, science and technology studies accounts, that tell us an awful lot about the history of primatology, for example, about the people involved, the cultural factors that drove their research and more, but that end up telling us next to nothing about the primates themselves, how they spend their days, what matters to them. Then, of course, there are natural historical accounts, often written by scientists and science writers, that propose to tell us a lot about the lives of primates in precisely this way, but that bracket out any of the real questions and complexity related to how those understandings are produced and maintained. In my view, multi-species scholarship is that body of work that tries to do both of these things at once. There is, as Bruno Latour has framed it, a genre of alternative natural history emerging. I take it that multi-species storytelling is one important strand of this effort to make traditional genres of writing about the natural world, to take them up in a way that insists that nature writing has always been and must more accountably embrace its position as a kind of nature culture writing. So rather than just drawing on the natural sciences, this work is often an effort to bring diverse knowledge traditions together. Inspired by Haraway's approach to situated knowledges, it aims to network partial perspectives, and in so doing to create fuller, more accountable knowledges about and with others. In this time of extinction, engaging responsibly with diverse knowledges about non-human lifeways has to be an effort to find new ways of helping these knowledges to speak to and against this unfolding crisis. Of course, the effort to do so in practice sometimes means that we don't take up or we footnote some of the more technical questions about how and why knowledges are produced. As such, when I'm writing, I frequently find myself asking, do I want to slow down more with how that fact was produced, with the histories and practices it emerged from, or will that distract in a way that's perhaps not really necessary from the story I want to tell here, from the effort to convey some of what is precious and remarkable about this disappearing way of life, and so distract from the connections I want to foster between the reader and an endangered species. Storytelling. Amongst all of the fascinating stories that might be told about snails in Hawaii, those of Kanaka Maoli or native Hawaiians stand out. Without doubt, the most consistent theme across numerous Hawaiian mo'olelo and mele, that's stories and songs, is the idea that snails sing in the forest. But they don't just sing at any old time. Rather, their singing is said to be deeply meaningful, often said to occur as a sign that after a series of adventures, changes, or turbulence, all is pono again, all is righteous, correct, and good. In recent years, however, the cultural significance of snails has taken new forms in Hawaii. Of particular interest to me has been their role in efforts to resist the destruction of Kanaka land and culture. In this respect, I've had the privilege of learning more about the work of the group Malama Makua. Since the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy and the subsequent colonization of the islands by the United States in the late 19th century, more and more land in Hawaii has been swallowed up by the US military for bases and other facilities. For decades now, Malama Makua have waged a sustained struggle against the army to reclaim Makua Valley on the island of Oahu, a sacred place that's long been used for live fire training and munitions detonations and dumping. So snails have been a key component of this work. While cultural sites in the valley long went unacknowledged, The US Endangered Species Act gave these people a basis for a lawsuit and the opportunity to bring the army to the negotiating table. Navigating emerging forms of multi-species solidarity with snails and snail scientists, Malamamakua have been able to prevent any further destruction of this place for almost 2 decades, while the US military has also, initially very reluctantly, become one of the largest funders of snail conservation in the islands. So my exploration of snail worlds in Hawaii, like my previous multi-species work, takes the form of a set of stories. This is by no means the only way to do multi-species scholarship, but it's one that appeals to me for a variety of reasons. Not least amongst these motivations for storytelling is the previously mentioned desire to draw wider audiences into a sense of appreciation for non-human life. But there's more to multi-species storytelling than the simple fact that narratives can be memorable, accessible, and engaging to wide audiences. Much of my effort to think through storytelling has been a collaboration with the late Deborah Bird Rose. In particular, we've explored how this approach might be an important ethical work. In our case, often in particular response to multi-species communities that form and are at stake at the edge of extinction. So we've argued for lively ethographies, stories that allow us to thicken the presence of these beings at the edge of extinction, to add flesh to the bones of the dead and dying. Our contention has been that as we learn more about, for example, snail biogeography and evolution, or about their reproductive and other behaviours, these creatures become something more than another Latin binomial on a long list. They emerge as distinctive ways of life. At the same time, these kinds of stories are also able to draw out how these particular ways of life mattered for others, that as they disappear, they unravel whole constellations of relationships. In this way, the focal species or group of species that animates our inquiries is a starting point rather than an exhaustive focus. Our stories ripple out from these forms of life to consider the wider worlds that they're co-constituted in and with. For example, what becomes of the forest ecologies that snails contributed to as they disappear, the soils that they help to produce, the plants whose leaves they once cleaned. Hawaii's tree snails didn't eat leaves, but they rather scraped the microbes from the surface of leaves. So the answers to these ecological questions are actually a little bit of a puzzle, but that's a topic for another day. We might also ask, what does the decline and disappearance of snails mean to Kanaka Maoli, who have inherited stories of singing snails? What becomes of these stories when there are no more snails left in the forest? Extinction ripples out into the world in myriad ways, cutting across imagined distinctions between ecology and culture. Good stories help us to see and become responsible for these ripples. So in particular, in storytelling particular species losses in this way, we've worked to highlight that there is no singular extinction phenomenon. Each species lost is its own unique happening. In fact, we've aimed to particularize the process of extinction even more than this, insisting that for any given extinction, there is no singular meaning or experience. Rather, there's a set of entangled, deeply unequal unravelings, and of course, re-ravelings, for better or worse. More than simply recounting this complexity, we've argued that stories offer a particularly rich mode of grappling with it. In other words, as I noted a moment ago, that storytelling is or can be a fundamentally ethical work. The kind of extinction stories we've advocated for have emphasized the importance of allowing multiple meanings to travel alongside one another, holding open possibilities and interpretations, and refusing the kind of closure that prevents others from speaking or becoming. While stories can certainly be crafted in an effort to shut down this kind of complexity and force through particular conclusions, they can also be vital technologies for other, more open and ongoing engagements with the world. It's this capacity of storytelling to summon up a thicker sense of the diverse, overlapping, and sometimes conflicting meanings and consequences of extinction that we've found so ethically productive. Grounded in established critiques of ethics as a calculable and generalizable domain, we've worked to hold open questions of what or who matters and why, to relentlessly ask with others, what does this loss mean, for whom, and what else is possible here? In this context, storytelling is an effort to draw ever more voices and perspectives into the discussion to attend to the situated complexity of this extinction, this encounter, and in so doing, craft a response, albeit one that is necessarily partial, contestable, and open to revision. As Isabelle Stengers has put it, what you are responsible for is paying attention as best you can, to be as discerning, as discriminating as you can about a particular situation. That is, you need to decide in this particular case and not to obey the power of some more general reason. So the point of telling stories like these, of course, is not simply to inform, but to transform. And it's here that much of the ethical charge of stories lies. As the philosopher Megan Craig notes, the stories we tell and those we hear bear profoundly upon the texture of our lives and our openness or closedness to other forms of life. In summoning up other beings and their worlds of relationship, stories draw us into a situated encounter, into new understandings, and with them, new responsibilities. So I take it that one of the key commitments of such an approach is the notion that storying with various plants, animals, and other non-humans provides a unique and valuable vantage point on human lives and dramas, including systems of intra-human inequality and oppression. It's certainly possible for efforts to think about the environment or take seriously the well-being of animals and plants to end up homogenizing humanity in problematic ways. And there's a great deal of scholarship and activism that has done just this. And there's decades of scholarship on intersectional approaches to animals and environments that's critiqued those approaches. But as I understand it, the effort in multi-species studies to pay serious attention to the non-human is not an effort to abandon all of the good work in anthropology, cultural studies, and other fields that has attended to human difference, to ways of life and social and political structures in complex and nuanced ways. Rather, it's an addition or a supplement to those approaches. The goal is explicitly one of multiplication, of attending to human and non-human difference, multiplying voices, agencies, matterings, in an effort to produce better accounts of and possibilities for our unavoidably, even if only ever partially, shared worlds. So while multi-species scholarship must surely avoid simply putting other species in the service of better understanding and responding to human dramas, these other species also matter in and of themselves. I'm firmly of the view that if multi-species scholarship has nothing interesting or useful to say about processes of colonization, militarization, globalization, and more, then something has gone very wrong. But I don't think that's the case. Across a growing body of multi-species work, we're learning, for example, how working with elephants in India enables not only conservation outcomes, but creates and reinforces particular kinds of class structures. I'm thinking of Ursula Munster's work. Or thinking of Sophie Chow's work, how a deadly fungus provides not only material aid, but inspiration for resistance to emerging plantations for the Maringe people of West Papua. Or thinking with Heather Swanson's work about how salmon farming in Japan has taken form through complex material semiotic practices of comparison that have simultaneously shaped fish bodies and landscapes, but also notions of nationhood, civilization, masculinity, and much more in Japan. In my own recent work, I hope we're learning more about how snails might become allies for Kanaka Maoli in their struggles to protect Makua Valley. As Uncle Sparky, a kupuna and leader of the group Malama Makua, put it in a response to an early draft of my writing on the valley, it's an effort to reweave a familiar tale, to draw attention to the profound role that snails have had, and in so doing to elevate, in his words, one of Hawaii's smallest and slowest snails into Makua's greatest warriors. So in multi-species scholarship, passionate immersion in the lives of non-humans does not simply travel alongside a discussion of and interest in questions of intra-human politics and justice. Rather, it becomes a vital new way into these topics, offering new perspectives, new opportunities, new allies, and identifying possible obstacles and pitfalls. Sometimes taking non-humans seriously matters in these contexts because, as intersectional analyses have shown, diverse systems of oppression around categories of race, gender, species, and more are mutually reinforcing. As such, they're best understood and addressed in their interwoven structural forms, not one at a time. I'm thinking, of course, of the work by people like Val Plumwood and Claire Jean Kim. But these general structures take material form in myriad ways within diverse more than human landscapes. Messy, uncertain, and sometimes surprising ways that don't necessarily work out how anyone thinks they will. As such, what's needed is the careful work of tracking in detail, historical, ethnographic, ecological detail, precisely how these relationships and possibilities are taking form, so as to create new entry points into alternative worldings. So through my snail research, I've been increasingly drawn to the science of taxonomy, to the fine-grained work of specialists studying snail shells, anatomy, and genetics in order to piece together an understanding of who is who. This is fascinating work that moves between museum collections, laboratories, and the field, and draws on a range of resources to carefully construct these entities we call species. In the worlds of snails, species certainly cannot be readily distinguished by the layperson, perhaps not even by the specialist without the use of sequencing or dissection. Species have to be pieced together, and they're contested in fascinating ways. In much of my former work, mostly focused on birds, taxonomy sat quietly in the background. Everyone seemed to be largely in agreement about what or who the endangered species in question was. To be sure, every now and again, questions popped up about the threat of hybridization or possible subspecies, or even whether a new behavior might undermine the authenticity of the species that conservationists were trying to hold on to. But in snail worlds, taxonomy is present in a very different way, as it is in many invertebrate contexts. Some of my interlocutors called it triage taxonomy, identifying species as an integrated part of efforts to save them, and of course focusing on describing species that there's still time to help. There are many questions to be asked here, including whether or not conservation should be so species-centric in its thinking. But insofar as it is, official taxonomic designations, even with all their contestations and shifts, especially once we get beyond the world of mammals and birds, these official taxonomic designations carry a lot of weight. And so how different scientists with a focus on different taxa define what a species is and go about describing it matters. And of course, these practices and species definitions are multiple. And Evan Kirksey's work on the praxeography of species, I think, offers a lovely discussion of this multiplicity. But I resist the suggestion that species is simply a Western scientific or a Eurocentric category. Haraway has already charted the much more complex and much broader etymological histories and possibilities of this term. I want to hold on to these broad possibilities and broaden them a bit further. I read the term species as an invitation to take seriously all manner of different practices of distinguishing and difference-making, human and non-human. So these include indigenous and other cultural modes of taxonomizing. The many beautiful, evocative names for snails in Hawaii highlight the close attention and the profound significance that these beings hold for Kanaka Maoli. Amongst these names, some of my favorites include Pupu Kanioi, literally translating as shell sounding long, referencing the snail singing that I mentioned a moment ago, and Pupu Moeone, the shell that sleeps in the sand, Hinihini Ula, the shell with the beautiful rainbow colors. But Kanaka taxonomy is not simply a question of names, it's also a detailed system of ordering kinds. Sadly, we don't have much information about how that was done with snails, although we have wonderful information by Noah Gomez about how bird taxonomy was done and about the higher order taxonomic categories that were used by Kanaka. So tending to different ways of naming and categorizing snails and other species matters, not least because it allows us to see how scientific approaches to taxonomy have been, and in some ways continue to be, implicated or at least complicit in the colonizing process. Here, old names and ways of ordering the world are forcefully overwritten by the distancing, unfamiliar languages of the newly arrived, frequently in ways that celebrate the colonizers by attaching their names to newly discovered kinds. For Hawaii snails, Achatonella dollii is a case in point. Named in 1895, that's 2 years after the overthrow of the Hawaiian Queen and her government, the published species description notes, we take pleasure in dedicating this beautiful shell to His Excellency S.B. Dole, first President of the Republic of Hawaii. This is the republic that had taken the place of the overthrown monarch. So importantly, and in other work, I've looked in much more detail at how snail taxonomy and the display of snails by amateurs and professionals in Hawaii was used and woven into this colonizing process to displace traditional names. So importantly, it's not just other humans making what we might think of expansively as taxonomic distinctions. Vicien Desprez, for example, urges us to consider how it is that lions understand lionness, how they decide who is and is not a lion. Eben Kirksey reminds us about how wasps align themselves with particular kinds of fig trees. As wasps are the key pollinators for figs, the way in which they identify appropriate figs matters for the future of these species. It matters because they pollinate them, and so they cross-pollinate. What might be thought about as different species of figs, but perhaps they're not different species from a wasp's perspective, and so they won't be able to be much longer from any other perspective either if the wasps continue their cross-pollinating work. So even amongst the snails, all sorts of fine-grained divisions are being made about others. For the most part, these seem to be mucus-centered, as snails rely on chemosensory perception. So while snails using their chemosensory perception to read cues in the mucus trails that are laid down by others. On this basis, research has shown that snails are generally pretty good at determining who is and is not one of their kind, and so who might be a good potential mate, predator or prey, or perhaps just a good guide to a suitable spot to seal up during the heat of the day. How knowledges of these snail practices of slime trail reading and following are themselves pieced together is also a fascinating story. What cues do different species pick up on, how and why? Sadly, we're going to have to leave most of that aside for today. So in Hawaii, there are also highly consequential stories to be told about this kind of mucus trail reading that snails do, especially because most of the remaining species are threatened so significantly by Euglandina rosea, the introduced carnivorous snail. Although brought to the islands in an attempt to control other introduced snail pests in agricultural contexts, these predatory snails were more than capable of adding the native species to their menu and picking up on, and it seems preferentially, following the slime trails of the native species to consume them rather than their supposed target species. So how non-humans make these kinds of taxonomic distinctions matters profoundly. And so tuning into it really matters in our storytelling. In short, then, I take species, the term species, these categories called species, as an invitation to pay attention to how diverse humans and other species interact with different kinds, how they make consequential cuts in a world of difference that holds significance for them in one way or another, often different differences to the ones that we, whoever we might be focused on. Here we see that the question of species, understood in this broad sense as an attention to different modes of life that we share and make worlds with, this attention to species leads back to passionate immersion, to ask about what makes a particular mode of life distinctive, to ask how a particular being does its world, is to begin the process of passionate immersion. Of course, to immerse oneself in non-human life is not necessarily to attend to biological species. In other work, and I put a couple of references on the slide, Deborah Rose and I argued for the need to disrupt any assumed correlation between what we called ethea, or distinctive ways of life, and the biological species categories of scientific taxonomists. Instead, how these cuts are made, what is recognised as a distinctive way of life, depends in large part on who is looking or sensing, for what purpose, and to address what questions or issues. Attending to these difference-making apparatuses to which kinds of life are understood, differentiated, and valued in what ways, and which are lumped together or ignored entirely, is a key part of this work. So this kind of multi-species storytelling has much to offer in response to the unfolding catastrophe of our time. Refusing neat distinctions between humans and everyone else, it offers a vital mode of understanding and communicating the complex, entangled, natural cultural reality of life and death on the planet, of how all of us come into and out of being, of how we together make and unmake worlds. In short, as Eben Kirksey, Ursula Munster and I noted in our co-authored paper, only human stories will not serve anyone in a period shaped by escalating and mutually reinforcing processes of biosocial destruction, from mass extinction to climate change, from globalization to terrorism. This kind of multi-species analysis might provide a foundation from which to prepare for and respond to disasters of many kinds, from extinction events and floods and fires and droughts connected to escalating process climate change, to the accumulating impacts of a growing number of toxicants. All of these disasters are unavoidably multi-species stories. Importantly, in storying disaster, multi-species approaches must emphasize the inescapably biocultural nature of these events. This is a point that's been made well by others, attending to the social, economic, and political contexts within which all disasters emerge and are experienced, and consequently insisting that there is no such thing as a natural disaster. But the complexity also exists in the opposite direction. Supposedly human-made disasters also always involve diverse non-humans in their origins and impacts. We might think of the mangroves sheltering or failing to shelter urban developments from storms. We might think of viruses mutating and proliferating to evade human efforts at containment, or the ways in which water hyacinth have taken advantage of the conditions created by engineering projects to spread throughout riverine ecosystems, causing significant damage and disturbance to diverse human projects. Sorry, those three examples were drawn from the work of Kate Judith, Eben Kirksey, and Anna Singh, all multi-species thinking. So in all of these cases and countless others like them, non-humans exert a vital agency in producing what is seen by many to be a disaster. But of course, taking non-human perspective seriously also reminds us that what counts as a disaster for some is anything but for others. A multi-species approach has to hold this complexity together, exploring the many forms of more than human agency that co-produce so-called disasters. But importantly, it also has to multiply our sense of who a given event or change is a disaster for and how. In short, it aims to attend both to the agency of non-humans and to the diverse impacts on non-humans, so as to better articulate the significance of these events for a diversity of beings. Importantly, however, a multi-species lens would also push us to situate any given disaster within the broader context that we might think of today as our catastrophic times. In borrowing this phrase from Isabelle Stengers, I aim to remember that the many disasters we face today ought not to be understood as occasional interruptions in an otherwise peaceful world. While I'm sure there are many ways to think disaster, and I wish I was at the conference to hear more of them, to my ear, this term has connotations of event, rupture, interruption. In contrast, the catastrophic times that Stengers describes are now unavoidably with us. They're not going anywhere. There will be no return to normal, whatever this might mean, whenever this might have been. As Stengers puts it, Gaia has been awakened. We cannot ignore her. We cannot send her away. We cannot put her back to sleep. In framing our situation in this way, Stengers pushes beyond a fixation on singular crises or disasters, whether we're thinking about this flood, this fire, this species extinction, or thinking at a larger scale about global climate change or the biodiversity crisis more generally. Either way, we're still thinking too small, too simply, too disconnectedly. The catastrophe of our times is multiple, and it cuts across supposedly natural and cultural domains. This is very much how I understand the Hawaiian snail stories I've shared with you today. The ongoing extinction of snail species is not a disaster or even a set of disasters. It's not something that's neatly separable from the broader disaster of biodiversity loss in Hawaii, which after all is one of the extinction capitals of the world. It's not something that's separable from the many disasters of a changing climate or ongoing disasters of colonialism, militarism, and the gross economic inequality that characterises life in these islands. And on we go. Any adequate understanding of this situation and any meaningful effort to imagine and enact alternatives must be able to hold this kind of natural cultural complexity together. I take it that this is a key part of what Stengers aims to do when she draws our attention to the fact that we're living in catastrophic times. Good storytelling, multi-species storytelling, also aims to do precisely this. Thanks very much. I'll leave it there.
Fabulous. And I said in your absence in opening the symposium yesterday that this symposium with the focus on disaster preparedness in multi-species worlds was intended to, in fact, weave together our two previous themes of decolonial cultural ecologies and multi-species conviviality with disaster preparedness. And what you've just presented did that to perfection. So thank you so much. We have 15 minutes for questions and comments. So who would like to begin? Yes, Laura.
This is for Zoom and this is for the room.
Okay. Thank you, Thom. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Okay. This was wonderful. Thank you very much. I was making some connections as you were talking with some topics discussed also yesterday. So, for example, the EI and how we are not discussing in the humanities how it's affecting people's capacities of reading a text, for example. And I was thinking about extinction and distinction. I don't know if you heard about these direwolves that were returned from extinction. Yes, by this biosciences enterprise. I don't know the name of the enterprise, but anyway. So we are now dealing with species being distincted, right? And we are not tackling this in humanity, in environmental humanities, at least not that I am familiar with discussions. And you were mentioning of using storytelling to transform the world. I wanted to ask, how do you see storytelling challenging this dystopic reality we are living now, that we have like a species being distincted, and can we take something positive from that? Because as I see, we are using, not we, but some capitalist interests are using this as an excuse to keep doing what we are doing, what they are doing. So if species are extinct, it's reversible, so we can somehow change it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks very much. Well, firstly, I think we need to do away with the term de-extinction. I think it's a marketing term. And as we've seen in the direwolf case, that species has not been resurrected in any meaningful sense of the term. And so the need to slow down with the scientific process, the need to explore what's actually being done here, whether it's through allele replacement technologies like that is being attempted with the passenger pigeon, or whether it's through somatic cell nuclear transfer, or or backbreeding, whatever the particular approach to de-extinction is. We need to slow down with it and actually understand what's being done here. And as a lot of commentators have pointed out in the case of the direwolf, that this is not a meaningful recovery of anything. So I think that's maybe the first point. The other point is there is quite a bit of really nice environmental humanities work on de-extinction. I agree that we could always use more, but I think of work by people like Matthew Trelew, Debbie Rose and I have written about de-extinction together. Stephanie Turner has done a lot of nice work on de-extinction. I'm sure I'm forgetting many people who have done nice work here. I think Dolly Jurgensen must have done some work on this topic too. Janice Sodikoff, and I'm now forgetting the name of the beautiful book on the frozen zoo in San Diego. Someone in the room will hopefully know the name of the author. Anyway, also about de-extinction. So I think there is some work trying to think about this and thinking about what de-extinction means, or what these projects mean, and trying to, at least the work that Debbie Rose and I did on the topic, trying to situate these dreams, these these marketing agendas, as they often are, these high-tech fantasies, in their political context, their economic context, but also in their social and context. That the vast majority of these efforts really don't take seriously the question of where these animals would go if they were to come back in some meaningful sense. And that's both about not taking seriously the ecological context, but also the context that many of these species, we look at things like dire wolves, or the thylacine that in Australia is another candidate that's frequently talked about, or the passenger pigeon. These were, to a large extent, killed by people because they didn't want to live with them. And so we need to take that social context really seriously too. And that just isn't happening. So the need to do that kind of contextual, situating, multidisciplinary work, I agree, is vital, and it isn't happening. So I would say yes, do more of it. But I would suggest checking out some of those people I mentioned who are thinking about de-extinction explicitly, but also there's a huge body of work on restoration and returning species to an area that have become extinct in that area. And I think that's a really valuable literature to draw lessons from too.
Another contributor to this discussion is Lisa Sedaris, also works on sort of de-extinction in really interesting ways. Now, I might take two questions together, and then you can respond, Tom. And there's Efrat, and yes, indeed, yeah. But could you go ahead?
So thanks a lot, Tom, for the talk. It's such a shame you're not here, but we're looking forward to your visit later. I wanted to come back to the idea of the species concept as an invitation to modes of making cuts in a continuous world of difference or something. And I wanted to ask, what about our idea of life and non-life? Like, I work on rivers, for instance, and there is a lot of scholarship that has been saying, rivers are not, are maybe alive, might be beings, might have rights like a person, etc. And how would that work with your expanded idea of a species? Would you say a river can be a species, or a hill, or a forest, or something, or would that stretch it too far? And then, in order to ascertain that, isn't it that in the end we do rely on people talking about species, or how do we? I mean, isn't that fine to do that? Because otherwise it's just us assuming that whatever we see and hear and perceive is the right way to do that. And isn't it good to be able to rely on people talking about species? Thank you.
Hi, Tom. Hi.
Marcel.
How you doing? I was wondering about, I've been thinking about, with the PhD students in Edinburgh, we've been thinking a lot about arts of noticing, arts of attention. And I noticed that you used passionate immersion, maybe rather than arts of noticing and arts of attention. And we've also been really interested in how, when Anna Singh, when I think she first started talking about it, she was talking about arts of inclusion, which seems to have kind of got lost in the conversation around this kind of, you know, inculcating curiosity and attention, and the arts of inclusion being it's arts of other people, including us in their love for this species and teaching us to love. And I don't know, I was just wondering what you thought about that shift from arts of inclusion to arts of noticing, and do you think that's different from passionate immersion? You know, that kind of complexity is there. It'd be nice to hear what you think about that.
Thanks so much. I'm going to do my best to answer those questions in a few minutes. So on the life, non-life binary, I would say, I think definitely that multi-species scholarship needs to be thinking about forms of being, ways of being that are potentially non-living, abiotic. I think who gets to decide what counts as biotic and abiotic is itself also a very loaded question and a taxonomic question. So, you know, the work of people like Hugo Reinert, who I think is on the Zoom, which is lovely. Hi, Hugo. The work of Kim Tallbear, a wonderful book that's not out yet that Sophie Chow has edited called Beyond Bios, is all about this sort of question of multi-species approaches to the life, non-life borderlands, and drawing on a whole range of different ontologies to think about how to make that distinction and what weight that distinction carries. But I would say very briefly, I think, yes, we can talk about the mode of being of sandstone compared to granite, of this kind of river versus that kind of river. I don't know enough about rivers. And so I think any kinds of entities where we can become curious and passionately immersed in the distinctive way of being that they have, and begin to ask questions about how knowing more about that way of being helps us to see the world differently, helps us to think about the world and inhabit the world differently. I think that is part of what multi-species scholarship should be about. I think we briefly discussed this in the paper I referenced that I wrote with Eben and Ursula, and it's taken up in more detail in this longer version of this paper. So the point about people talking about animals, I'm not saying we don't want to do that, and we don't want to include those kinds of conversations. I'm saying they can only or should only be part of the discussion. I don't think that means we have to adopt a kind of naive pretense of objectivity in the way we draw on the knowledge-making practices of others or of particular communities. I think we need to bring diverse knowledge-making practices about non-humans into dynamic tension with one another, in that kind of situating of partial perspectives way that Haraway encourages us to do. I think that gives us a better way into who these other beings are. It's not an objective account. We will never have that kind of access to other modes of life, but I think it does allow us to think in interesting, rigorous ways about who these other beings are. And then the question about the diverse languages here. I think in other work, I've written about the art of attentiveness rather than attention, and I think I like attentiveness because I think it holds a kind of empirical and an ethical charge, an epistemological and ethical charge. To be attentive is both an ethical and an epistemological work. So I think that's something that gets lost sometimes in the language we use when we think about noticing, for example, has no ethical connotations for me. You can notice all sorts of things and not be in any way implicated or drawn to respond. To be attentive is something more than that. But I take your point. I hadn't thought about that, and I remember having just recently reread Sting's paper in Environmental Humanities, I think volume 1, on the arts of inclusion, that she was using a sort of a different language there and thinking a lot more about how scientists are allowed to love but not allowed to show their love. I think that needs to be part of the conversation. And it's something that I reread the paper because it's something I'm currently writing about which kinds of what kind of love biologists are allowed to show, or what kinds of interest in the species they study. so that yeah, the way we do attention really matters, or attentiveness. I like the language of passionate immersion because I guess it is for me the opening into how we think about really seriously paying attention to others. I think we need to really do that seriously. I think there's too much humanities scholarship that doesn't take that seriously. That instead sort of, you know, is willing to just draw on reflection and speculation about what a species might be up to, or what a particular organism might be up to. I think we need to be more careful about the ways that we attend to non-humans. But then I think we have to do that in a way that multiplies. So I guess my interest in inclusion is about that multiplication work. So I would say that the approach to storytelling that I'm advocating for, that kind of multiplying work, the networking of partial perspectives, is very much an effort to do a kind of inclusion work that is also a kind of ethical work that is also embedded in these questions, or tangled up with these questions of love, and of who gets to love whom, and who gets to whose ways of knowing and whose ways of caring are, you know, rendered, are made intelligible, are made acceptable within dominant social contexts. A long rambling answer, but I'm out of time. Sorry.
We are out of time, but we have also an online audience. We have an online audience, and we have a question from somebody online. So maybe if, yes, the question is brief, and Tom, if you can also endeavor to respond briefly, we'll include an online question as well.
Yes, I would just read that out loud. So there's around 20 people listening online, and Tanya asked, "Many thanks for your talk, Tom. My question is, given the meaningful specificity of each situation, I wonder what helps you or guides you to pay attention and exercise or negotiate responsibility differently each time as a storyteller. And if you could just say a little bit about what that difference might be, if any."
Yeah, so I think that's why the kind of field philosophy approach is of so much interest to me. I started out as a philosopher who didn't do field work. And I was lucky enough to have a wonderful anthropologist as one of the examiners of my thesis. And she made a comment that really stuck with me, where she said in chapter 2, if this had been an anthropology thesis, you would have gone out into the field, and the field would have tested your ideas. You didn't do that. And she was very generous and open about the fact that I hadn't done that as a philosopher. But that really stuck with me. And I guess I started doing more field work. I had done some interviews and things for my PhD. This was quite a while ago now. But this idea of the field testing what we think and what we do, and pushing us to think in different ways, is really important. And I should refer people to the wonderful edited collection by Michelle Bastian, who's in the audience, and others on field philosophy, as I think the best place where these debates are being taken up. So I think that's how I am pushed differently in different cases. It's the particular animals, species that I'm thinking with in the particular context. So when you do field work, you are pushed and pulled in different directions. And I think we should take seriously the different way that different taxa push us when we pay attention to them. So for me, the difference between writing a book on crows and writing a book on snails is huge. I moved from thinking mostly with cognitive biologists to thinking mostly with taxonomists and biogeographers. And that's largely because those are the questions, or that those are really interesting conceptual spaces with regard to those species, but they're also where some really interesting pertinent questions that matter for extinction and conservation are being asked. So if we take seriously the taxa we're thinking with, they push us in different directions. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was fantastic. And I would just invite everybody to thank Tom once again, and thanks also for your attention and questions and engagement. And we look forward to working you here in person, Tom, in due course.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, bye for now.
I'll sign off. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.